the wet on wet technique, we are gonna wet our paper. And this technique is really good for creating sort of a loose, free, it's a very kind of spontaneous and free expression of color and of patterns. You really kind of allow the water to make decisions for you while you just use colors. So you'll see here that I am really making my watercolor very, very wet. And then if I dab it in there, do you see how it spreads? So I'm going to use a little red here. And I'm going to just keep using my water as like a guide. And I'm just kind of letting it spread all on its own. And this creates a very, very sort of free-spirited, loose background. It's very spontaneous. And you get to kind of just let the color take you where the water wants to go. So I'm just going to kind of like keep filling in. And you see how like nice and light it is right now? So I'm just like getting more and more color. I'm layering it in there. I'm going to kind of blend a little bit with that blue. And I'm creating the background that later I'll go over. Bri, your warm-up looks fantastic, by the way. Okay, so I'm just layering this in. Do you see how it's spreading and doing its own thing? While this is still wet, you guys, I'm going to add a little salt to it. So to show you how that can react once I get some of these colors in here. I want a little bit of red spreading throughout. And if you mix red and blue, what do you get, folks? If you said purple in your mind, then good job, you're correct. All right, so this is still pretty wet. I'm going to take a little bit of salt here and I'm going to just pool it in certain areas. And we're going to let that dry. While it's drying, though, I do want to add one little effect. No, let's let this dry for a bit. We're going to come back to this and we're going to go, can you see my hand here? Yep. We are going to go to a wet on dry, meaning our watercolor paper is going to be dry, but the watercolors themselves are really kind of juicy. It's a juicy watercolor palette here. Like biting into an orange. Okay, so I'm going to use some of this very wet red. As you hear my dog growling next to me. And I'm just coming down with it. Don't mind him, he's very old and grumpy. And then I'm going to fade. So do you see here how it kind of looks like two different blocks of color? With the wet on dry technique, it makes blending pretty easy because using my water kind of is the great, it's like the #1 tool that you need for watercolors is water. So then do you see how that kind of blends down? Almost like when you go to the barber and you ask for a sick fade. That's what we're creating right now. And that is done through the wet on dry technique. If you tried to do this with wet on wet, it might be a little bit challenging to keep all this stuff in place, because what typically happens with wet on wet, as you saw over here, is all of this stuff spreads. You don't have as much control. So if you really want to have like a nice fade, then you might want to leave that watercolor paper dry. And we'll just kind of smooth it out a little bit using my water. There you go. And then if I mix, I can even come in here with my big brush and really create a smoother look if I want, now that I have my base colors down. And there's a wet on dry. Wet paint, dry paper. Now we are going right, where's my hand? Right here. We're gonna do a dry on dry, meaning our watercolor paint is not nearly as juicy. It is pretty dry. Only a tiny bit of water has been added. And the paper itself is quite dry. So you will see here, the blue is very, very like kind of juicy and running, and the red also. But I'm gonna wet my brush a little bit. And then let's see, I'm gonna feel one that's kind of dry. Don't mind my husband, he has a very loud voice in the background there. Which one's dry? Okay, so this blue one right here where my finger is really dry right now. So I'm just gonna go on it with a brush that is a little damp, but it's not super duper wet. So I'm just getting some pigment. And then let's see, where's my hand here? All right, and then I'm gonna go in between. Do you see the difference already? This paint is not as wet, and this paper is dry. So like you can get almost textures on it. It doesn't spread at all. You can create lines. You can get a drier texture, where this is all smooth and blended, and this one's all random and crazy. Dry on dry is way more specific. So if you wanted to do line work, if you wanted to do letters, if you want to do like grass texture or wave texture, some sort of like hair texture, it's good with texture, I guess is what I'm saying. So then you see the black kind of coming on top there, and it's all wispy. Nothing spreads. Let me see if I can get you guys some up close here. So you see the blend, you see the wisp, and then I can't show you the wet on wet because my paper is too big. But you can see, I think, hopefully, that where the salt crystals were, it creates little pockets of negative space. So when this is dry and I sweep away the salt crystals, it will look almost like crystals, really, like the way crystals crack over water or glass. Like if you zoom in with a telescope on crystallized water and stuff, the molecules, the salt repels the water and it creates these really beautiful, almost like snowflake style patterns that are pretty. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you guys how tape in watercolor painting can be your friend. Let's say that you have a section of your watercolor background that you know you want to stay pure white. You don't want any watercolor to fade into it. You planned out your composition, and that's what you know you want. I'm just creating a little random design here. The only little trick to this is you really want to make sure that your edges are down, because if they're not, then the water will seep into areas that you want to be white. So I'm just creating a little random pattern with my tape. Whoopsies. The salt is already going everywhere. No biggie though. All right, so let me get some color.
In the chat there, I have what each room is going to be squeezing. So room 1 will be the soap portion.
I'm going to do like a blend, I think.
Focus on that.
That's what's kind of cool about watercolor. It's such an expressive sort of medium that as you're working with it, you can really like allow your intuition to guide you And if you know that you want to represent something that's like fierce or angry or turbulent or calm, relaxing or sad, you have all of this like freedom because you're using water and you're layering. It's very forgiving and very free. There's something very soothing about painting with watercolors. We are made up of, what, 98% water after all? Okay, so I'm just blending this in a little bit. Using water. And then I'm going to come back up here with that red to intensify it a little bit more towards the top and maybe out here. And if I wanted to blend that more, I could just add more water to my paper. So I think you can see everything I'm doing here. Yeah. So I'm just like kind of framing this out with red just because that's the kind of mood I'm in, I guess.
Does everybody know kind of what the arrow was that you was wrapping in? That you
And then you see how this doesn't look as blended, but I really want this to have a blended look. So I'm just going to use clean water and blend in between.
He's actually a West Coast rapper.
And then I'll come back with my blue to overlap. Okay, now drum roll, please. I think this is dry enough. We'll see. I don't want to mess it up, but here. We'll kind of, just for time's sake, we are going to peel away our tape. Careful not to touch the white parts that you don't want to have any paint on them.
Also within that, like you were saying, Adrian, there's a lot of.
So then you have this like negative space in here that you can use however you want, whether it's with pen and ink, or maybe it's a different color, or maybe it's a different medium, or whatever it might be. But you have this really beautiful negative space now that you can kind of mess with. And in fact, let's say I want to just kind of blend into it without such sharp lines. I could do that too. If I just wanted to create a negative space for myself for later. I'm using a brush that's fairly clean with just water in it. And I'm like kind of just getting rid of those really, really hard lines, which is, it's your option and your choice as an artist, which is the point of all of this, is like you have to decide what you think works best. I don't know your ideas and I'm not inside your head, so I don't know what you're trying to express, but this is all part of your process artistically. And our process this year of figuring out how to make the marks that best represent your thoughts and that best represent what's going on inside your head with whatever your idea might be. There's no wrong. There's no right. It's just you trying to figure out what works best. So then in that way, that's what it looks like when it's blended up. We just have little bits of white space in there. So here's our techniques. Let's see how wet that, this is still pretty wet, but like, look, if I sweep away the salt, oh, it's a little too wet still. You really want to wait till it's fully dry. But if you sweep it away, you'll start seeing the areas that were impacted and influenced by the salt. Do you see how they create beautiful little patterns here? So let me come back up to life here. Hi. Camera kind of blurry. Sorry, Carlos. That's the watercolor demo for the day. And this is recorded, so you guys can reference this whenever you want, again. And are there any questions? What are your guys' thoughts? What are your questions?
But let's put it this way. I grew up